让人把多那个真的嘛，其实对教人做过的这些我的叙说的。
So this morning we started to look at how you take rebirth in an incarnation. So having gone looked at the process of death, then into the intermediate state, and now birth from the intermediate state into the particular realm. So one thing that, in relation to what we're looking at this morning is to perhaps look at the situation of surrogacy, in that we may ask, so who is the parent? Because there's the sperm and the egg, the sperm and the ovum, then these come together and then are placed in that of a surrogate mother, in the womb of a surrogate mother. So there the parents would be, the father would be clear, and the producer of the ovum, that woman, would be the mother. And the surrogate mother, she would not, in this sense, be the mother of the child, but rather those who provided the sperm and ovum. So returning to the text, the final paragraph on page 177, the paragraph just concluded above that was looking at rebirth into the higher realms, the happier migrations. And now the final paragraph looks into rebirth into the lower realms. The levels of yogic practice says that if you are born as an animal, hungry ghost, or animal, or human being, or as a god in the desire and form realms, you will see delightful beings of similar type to yourself at your birthplace. Then, having generated delight in and desire for that, you will go there. As you get angry at your birthplace, the intermediate existence ceases and you are born there. Levels of yogic practice says that if you are born as an animal, hungry ghost, or human being, or as a god in the desire and a god in the form realms, so referring to all these states of birth, then you will see beings, so I'm just going to change the word order, but the meaning's fine. You'll see beings of similar type to yourself as at your birthplace, and your birthplace. So if you to be reborn as an animal, you will see beings of a similar type, so similar animals, as well as birthplace, the place one will take birth. And then the key, because that was said earlier, and then the key point is the word delightful, in that one will see beings of the same type as yourself, as well as the birthplace, as something delightful. In other words, one will take delight in seeing such beings and seeing such a birthplace. And it continues, then having generated delight in and desire for that, you will go there. So this delight, then from delight, then the attachment will arise, and the attachment will, maybe you could say, compel you or pull you in that direction, the direction of such beings and place of birth. In the third sentence, as you get angry at your birthplace, so this will be similar to what we heard about in the paragraph above in relation to human beings. As you get angry at your birthplace, the intermediate existence ceases and you are born there. So that the first sentence in this paragraph we see mentioned a variety of types of beings. So from the lower realms we have animals and hungry ghosts, and then those of the higher migrations of humans and gods in the form and desire realm. So that is all beings, with the exception, all beings that take rebirth via the bardo, with the exception of hell beings. So now the final sentence addresses hell beings explicitly. The way in which someone other than those, that would be hell beings, one who is devoted to wrongdoing, that's a term we had earlier, those without vows or haven't lived within vows, and trades in poultry, pigs and the like, is born in hell, is similar to this, so as just described. Thus far then, we've looked at the process of rebirth for beings who will be, explicitly, for beings who will be reborn from a womb. So that's been what's been discussed primarily. So there are other forms of rebirth. So now, turning the page, the top of page 178, here other forms of rebirth are addressed. So in the Treasury of Abhidhamma, the line, others strongly desire odors and an abode, means that if you're born from heat and moisture, you are born upon desiring odors. So a being that is in the Bardo and is to be born, and not from a womb, but with heat and moisture, so the form of birth will be due to heat and moisture. They are not drawn to parents. They're not drawn to a fertilized ovum. Rather, they are drawn by an odor, or desiring an odor. So this year, for those who are being born from heat and moisture. And then for those who are to be born spontaneously, it says, and if you are born spontaneously or miraculously, you are born upon desiring an abode. So those beings taking spontaneous rebirth will see their place of birth, and that will draw them in, and that will lead to their rebirth. The next sentence is specific then to hell beings. Moreover, the commentary explains that if you are born in the hot hells, you go to the immediate state upon desiring heat, whereas if you are born in the cold hells, you go to the intermediate state upon desiring coolness. Here then, the conditions for rebirth for beings to be born in the hot and cold realms, as we see, will be desiring temperature, desiring either warmth or coolness. So this desiring or attachment for heat, or attachment for warmth, or attachment for coolness, this is what draws them to their rebirth. Then the final sentence presents the fourth and final type or means of birth, that from eggs. The Treasury of Abhidhamma also commentary explains birth from an egg to be similar to birth from a womb. So that's then the four types of birth. We've looked at womb, eggs, heat and moisture, and spontaneously. So we've looked then at these four different means of birth, primarily looking at that from a womb, but also now briefly at birth from heat and moisture, spontaneously, or from an egg. So this entire process starts with the current life coming to an end, propelling karmic imprint ripening at the time of death, propelling the next rebirth. And this next rebirth is likely to go by means of the intermediate state, and then there is death from the intermediate state and birth into that new realm, that new rebirth that was propelled by the karmic imprint. So the important part to be clear on is this entire process is under the control of karma and afflictions. It's under the control of, or the power of, karma and afflictions. This is determining this entire process. And the second point, as we've seen here, is that in the intermediate state, the afflictions continue to play a role. Attachment in the sense of being drawn towards something, and anger in the final moments, leading to then rebirth being taken. So this then concludes the presentation on, first we looked at the process of death, and then the process of intermediate state, or transmigrating by means of the intermediate state, and then rebirth from the intermediate state into the new form, into the new realm, into the new life form. So this brings together many of the points that we have looked at thus far in the Lamrim. So we looked at a couple of years ago that this life that we have achieved, that has such potential, it is impermanent and it will end. And when it ends, it immediately is followed by a new birth. And that new birth is determined by the karma that has been accumulated and the imprint that ripens at the time of death and propels the new rebirth. And that propelling karmic imprint will lead us in one of two directions. either remaining in the higher realms as a human, as a desire realm god, a form realm god, or rebirth as a formless realm god, or send us to the lower realms as an animal, a spirit, or into the hells. So this is something we've spoken about extensively over the years, and we've looked at the process of the karma to be accumulated that leads us in one of these two directions, and we've spoken about the karmic causes that will lead to an excellent rebirth or another or a suffering rebirth in the lower realms. And throughout this process, we've also identified that all beings yearn for happiness. No being wants to suffer. So recognizing that, together with this bulk or body of knowledge that has been gathered, this should lead us, or should lead to strengthening our resolve to cultivate the causes that will determine that the karma that propels our next rebirth is virtuous. It's karma that will lead to an excellent rebirth. And this then is the overriding purpose here of understanding this. It's not a mere intellectual exercise, but to strengthen our resolve to embrace virtue and turn away from non-virtue. The section of the text we are in is having looked at true sufferings, then true origins. When we're looking at true sufferings, we looked at the suffering of the higher realms, of humans and gods. Because previously we had already looked at the sufferings of the lower realms. So thereby one has given rise to a wish already for rebirth in the higher realms as a human or god. But we looked at earlier in the year how as a human being as well as a god, one still experiences suffering. One is not yet free of suffering. The happiness that one experiences is contaminated. It is not actual happiness. So even if one attains an excellent rebirth in cyclic existence, which is as a human or god, one still suffers. And our wish for happiness isn't for a suffering experience like we have as a human, but for an experience completely free of suffering, a state of lasting, stable happiness, where one has attained actual happiness, a happiness that is never punctuated by even a moment of pain or misery. And as we saw in the chapter that we're in now, on true origins, that the reason beings suffer is because the karmic imprints that propel their rebirths, as well as the karmic imprints that ripen within a rebirth, those karmic imprints are contaminated. And they are contaminated because they were accumulated by an afflicted mind. So therefore, whether experiences of happiness or suffering are encountered, one will still suffer. One is not yet freed. Karma that needs to be accumulated needs to be uncontaminated. But for uncontaminated karma to be accumulated, the cause of contamination, the afflictions, need to be abandoned together with their seeds. Until that happens, until the contaminated karma and the afflictions are abandoned, suffering will naturally be experienced. It is the natural experience of a samsaric being that suffering will be experienced. That any forms of happiness are not true happiness. So we saw then, earlier in the chapter, that of the two, karma and afflictions, what really needs to be abandoned, the one that is primary, are the afflictions. These are what must be abandoned so that one can gain liberation from the sufferings of samsara, liberations from the suffering realms of samsara in their entirety. And to give rise to a determined attitude to emerge from the suffering realms of samsara is the very purpose of this section of this text. To give rise to the mind of definite emergence or renunciation, this mind that is definite or determined to emerge from the suffering realms of samsara. That is the purpose of these trainings, which are shared with a practitioner of intermediate capacity. So to bring together then what we've been looking at for the past few years is that we started first with an extensive introduction, and then we came to the trainings, which are shared with the practitioner of initial capacity. So those were the initial level of training one needs to engage in, the foundation that one needs to engage in, and that includes looking at the sufferings of the lower realms, and thereafter coming to recognize the causes for rebirth in the presentation of karma, the causes for rebirth in the lower realms, as well as the causes for rebirth in the higher realms. So we saw there that this rebirth we have is impermanent, and that it may potentially be followed by rebirth in the lower realms, and we looked at the sufferings there, and the causes, the karmic causes that will lead to rebirth there, as well as the karmic causes that will lead to rebirth in the higher realms. Then we came to the presentation of a practitioner that is shared with a practitioner of intermediate capacity. And there we looked at, but even when one attains rebirth in the higher realms, as a human or God, one still suffers. And we looked at the particular sufferings of beings in the human realm, as well as beings in the God realms, and sufferings of samsara in general. So all that has been looked at. And the purpose of looking at that was to give rise to a deep wish to not have to suffer in this way, to gain freedom from cyclic existence, recognizing that there is nothing with abiding value in samsara, to give rise for a yearning for freedom from that. Because that then, this is the meditation on true sufferings, leads to a yearning to find out what those causes are for that result, the result of suffering, and so that those causes can be abandoned. And there we saw in the presentation, it was contaminated karma and afflictions, of which of the two, afflictions are primary. They are what must be abandoned in order to gain liberation from the suffering realms of samsara, liberation from all the suffering experiences of samsara, and thereby attaining lasting, stable happiness. So the purpose of this entire presentation is to get us to give rise to such a determined attitude. And this final part we looked at was fleshing out the presentation of how death comes and is followed then by the intermediate state, and rebirth is taken. So we can see the role of the afflictions in terms of cultivating contaminated karma, the role the afflictions continue to play even in the intermediate state, and the taking of rebirth. All of this to lead us to the determined attitude to emerge from the suffering realms of samsara, and thereby attain liberation. So the mind of definite emergence or bodhicitta. Mind of definite emergence or renunciation. So this is the entire process we've gone through with the trainings shared, the practitioner of initial capacity, and then the trainings, that foundation, the trainings shared for the practitioner of intermediate capacity. All to give rise to this mind of definite emergence. Now we come on page 178 to the measure of its development, the development of this mind of definite emergence. So reading the first of two paragraphs. Just change a couple of words. When you have come to understand the characteristics of cyclic existence in detail from the point of view of suffering and their origins, the desire to eliminate them and the desire to attain their complete pacification arises. While this is indeed a simple attitude of definite emergence, it is not sufficient by itself. I'll read that sentence again. While this is indeed a simple attitude of definite emergence, it is not sufficient by itself. Therefore, you should generate that mind to the same extent as the mind that does not want to be stuck in a house ablaze with fire or stay locked up in prison, and to the same extent that it desires liberation from them. It will then still be necessary to increase it. What I'm trying to convey here is how the graduated stages of training the mind, the Lamrim, are presented in a particular sequence. By training in one, one is developing the foundation for the training in the next, and when that is completed, one has the foundation for training in the next, and so forth, bringing us to this point here. So therefore, it is this graduated, sequential training of the mind. And as one progresses through these trainings, as one engages in the latter trainings, that also serves to strengthen the earlier trainings. So there is this interdependent relationship between them. They are trained in sequentially, but the latter also impacts the former. So we started out by looking at the training shared with the practitioner of initial capacity, and as mentioned there, we looked at the sufferings of the lower realms, so the actual lived experience of beings suffering there now. And we saw that that is a potential where we may well take rebirth, depending on the causes accumulated, and thereby potentially propel rebirth in our next life. Thereafter, we looked at, there having given rise to a determined attitude not to be born in the lower realms, to turn away from non-virtue and embrace virtue, we then came to the trainings shared with the practitioner of intermediate capacity. So from the trainings of a practitioner of initial capacity, one is developing a determined attitude. I must close the possibility to be born in the lower realms in my next life, and must cultivate the causes for rebirth as a human or God. Now, building on that, one recognizes that even as a human or God, one still will suffer. There is nowhere, anywhere within samsara that has any abiding value in the sense of one has gained freedom from suffering. So in the context of the Buddhist teachings of Varanasi on the Four Noble Truths, this was the presentation on true sufferings, which the Buddha said need to be known. And we looked at this in the training shared the practitioner of initial and then intermediate capacity, coming to recognize, to know what is meant by suffering, not just the coarse level, but subtler levels. Then within the trainings of a practitioner of intermediate capacity, we looked at the second noble truth, true origins, which the Buddha taught needs to be abandoned. Because the origins or the origin of our suffering, the causes of suffering being the result of those causes, of those origins. And in looking at true origins, we saw that there are two, karma and afflictions. Of the two, it's the afflictions that are primary. And we also saw here now in the most recent presentation, last night, this morning, that the afflictions continue to play a role in the birth process, the intermediate state and so forth. So it's afflictions that have to be abandoned. And we also looked at karma in more detail. It was looked at in the trainings shared with the practitioner of initial capacity, and it was looked at now again in more detail in the trainings shared with the practitioner of intermediate capacity. And we saw that there's karma that is virtuous, karma that is non-virtuous, karma that is unspecified. And what marks out karma as being one of those three depends on the motivation. That is presented as further impetus to abandon the afflictions, because it's the afflictions that lead to the cultivation of non-virtue. So therefore, this should be becoming ever clearer. I need to abandon my afflictions so that my motivation is ideally not at all afflicted, but at least to be sure it's not non-virtuous. So this whole process that one engages in the trainings of a practitioner of intermediate capacity, which comes about independence on the prior training of the trainings shared with the practitioner of initial capacity, is all leading us to develop the actual path, mental path, of a practitioner of intermediate capacity. And that mental path is the mind of definite emergence. It is this determined attitude to abandon the afflictions together with their seeds. So this is the yearning for, the wish for liberation. And it is a mind that is not a mere passive wanting, but it's a striving. It's a determined attitude, a striving for liberation, which means it is a striving to abandon the afflictions together with their seeds. And when it has arisen, it needs to arise in a way that is stable and thereby transformative, so that the practitioner is guided by this attitude, whereby they know nothing matters other than gaining liberation from samsara, which means whatever I'm doing, I must ensure my mind is not deceived by the afflictions. This is the mind of definite emergence. This is what needs to be cultivated. And it will come at times, hearing teachings, gaining in meditation, but it needs to be cultivated again and again and again through a repeated reflection over a sustained period, so that it starts to arises in a more sustained manner, and starts to abide. So hence, this entire reflection presented over these last few years, bringing us to the point where one recognizes what suffering is, the causes of suffering, and gives rise to a determined attitude to gain freedom from suffering. Looking at the text, at that first paragraph, the measure of its development. And again, this word "it" refers to definite emergence, the very goal of all this training, to give rise to this determined attitude to emerge from the suffering realms of samsara. When you've come to understand the characteristics of cyclic existence in detail, so this then refers to the lower realm presentation on the lower realms that we looked at previously, and then the presentation on the higher realms from the point of view of sufferings and their origins. So one has come to recognize not only is a lower realm rebirth pervaded by suffering, but so too are rebirth in the desirable higher realms, the rebirth as a human or God. Here too, there is no lasting happiness to be experienced. So that's from the point of view of sufferings and their origins, the cause of suffering. So whether one is born in the lower realms or the higher realms, one remains bound in samsara. And the cause, whilst the intensity of suffering is vastly different, the cause remains the same: karma and afflictions, of which the two, afflictions, is primary. So that's from the point of view of suffering and their origins. The desire to eliminate them and the desire to attain their complete pacification arises. Here comes the determined attitude to gain freedom from the sufferings of samsara, through recognizing there is no abiding value to be found in samsara at all. So this is the meaning of the desire to eliminate them. This is referring to eliminate the causes of suffering so as not to experience the result. And this is done by abandoning the afflictions, because when the afflictions are abandoned, this is the desire to attain their complete pacification, the complete pacification or peace of mind that comes about through not having the afflictions which disturb the mind, the opposite to pacification. So maybe afflictions as disturbing emotions, as they are abandoned, the mind is pacified, the mind is at peace. So this is the objective, to generate this attitude of definite emergence. So in this final segments, starting with the desire to eliminate, this shows that there are two components to this mind. One, the first being a rejection, and the second being an embrace. Both of these need to be cultivated. So the rejection is the desire to eliminate them, so to eradicate suffering by eradicating the cause. So this is a rejection of the afflictions. And it comes together with the desire to attain their complete pacification. So this refers to an embracing of the state of liberation from the afflictions. So it's both a rejection of the afflictions and embracing of the state of pacification, whereby the mind is completely at peace and will never be disturbed by the afflictions ever again. Not just a temporary pacification, but a lasting, sustained pacification. So therefore, this mind that we need to train in has these two components. And this is important to cultivate both the rejection and an embrace. So to actually give rise to a desire to attain their complete pacification requires reflecting first on the faults of samsara and then its origins, these two sequentially but also together. one needs to give rise to a clear understanding of what is meant by samsara. And that clear understanding involves the understanding of true sufferings, to come to recognize that there is nothing worthy of hoping for in samsara, because that experience is still pervaded by suffering. And for that understanding to be transformative, one needs to understand the origin of suffering, particularly the afflictions, why it is that firstly, one is so deceived that thinks there is happiness in samsara, and secondly, why that so-called happiness of samsara is not actually happiness. So one needs to have this understanding and develop it so that it becomes strong within one. If it's weak, then one's wish for liberation will be weak, because one's rejection of the causes of suffering will be weak, and those rejection of the causes of suffering is weak because one's understanding of suffering remains superficial. So these various components need to be developed in a powerful way as to give rise to an actual path. So this then brings the meaning of definite emergence to the fore, and hopefully it is very clear. It has both this element of rejection or renunciation, but it also has a positive element, an embrace. So the rejection or the renunciation is the first part, the desire to eliminate them. So you can say it's the renouncing of the suffering and its causes. In particular, if one wants to use the word renunciation, it's referring to renouncing the causes of suffering, renouncing the afflictions. But this term, definite emergence, has this positive embrace as well, not just a rejection, but also an embracing of. And this comes about through understanding that there is a lasting happiness is possible. Suffering is not inevitable, in that once the causes of suffering are eradicated, lasting, stable happiness is attained. So therefore, there also needs to be a yearning for liberation. So there's both a rejection, the rejection of the causes of suffering, and a yearning for a state freed of suffering. So it has these two components, and that is the meaning of definite emergence. So therefore, it's good to take this meaning to heart, or to put it in one's mind, so that when one reads text and reads about, again, you'll probably have the word renunciation, that you understand it has these two components, the renouncing of the causes of suffering, primarily the afflictions, but it also has the positive component, this wanting to emerge from suffering into a state of lasting, stable happiness. A term we know best through the title of a short text by Lama Tsongkhapa, 3 Principal Aspects of the Path. Here, we've been looking at one of those 3 principal aspects, that of definite emergence, the foundational training for the other 2 aspects, bodhicitta and correct view. And this is also mentioned in the verses of auspiciousness at the end of Lama Chöpa. Again, I recited the verses, translated, I don't know it, but it's something along the lines of maybe all be auspicious to give rise to the stages of definite emergence, bodhicitta, and correct view. So the point I'm really wanting to hope or drive home so that it's clear is what the meaning of definite emergence is. So when you hear the word definite emergence, or you read the word renunciation, you know it has these 2 components, and that meaning immediately comes to mind. So therefore, what we've been looking at for quite some time has all been leading sequentially, training the mind to this point, to come to the point where we have at least a clear understanding of suffering and its origins, sufferings in the lower realms, and then the suffering in the high realms, and the origin of all suffering, so as to give rise to the renunciation of that, but also with the understanding that lasting happiness is possible. And in this way, with these 2 components, to generate definite emergence. Hopefully then, it is clear what is meant by definite emergence. Now, the next sentence, and here I just added a couple of words and changed one. While this is indeed a simple attitude of definite emergence, it is not sufficient by itself. So what I inserted as a simple, it can most commonly translated as a mere attitude of definite emergence. In other words, merely having this understanding or merely giving rise to it to some degree is not sufficient by itself. So if having this desire to eliminate the causes of suffering and the desire to attain their complete pacification arises, while this is indeed a simple attitude of definite emergence, it is not sufficient by itself. So having a genuine wish to gain liberation from samsara, this is said to be insufficient. So what is sufficient then? What is the measure of definite emergence arising in a way that can be said to be sufficient? Well, the analogy then comes in the next sentence. Therefore, you should generate, let's skip until keep the order the same. A house ablaze with fire. So if one imagines one is inside a building, one smells smoke, looks up, sees flames surrounding one, how would one respond? One sees oneself is inside a building that is ablaze. And you recognize that this fire is surrounding you and it's about to engulf you. What are you going to do? You're not going to sit around. You're not going to think, oh, maybe this, maybe that. You are going to flee. You are going to gain your freedom from the suffering that is engulfing you. Of that, we can have no doubt. So such a mind that is thinking of nothing else but gaining freedom from suffering that is about to engulf you, such a mind is the measure of having generated actual definite emergence. It's usually expressed as nothing else matters but gaining liberation. But as there's the sense of urgency that I cannot delay, nothing else needs to be contemplated, it is time to go. And the second illustration is given, that of staying locked up in a prison. So again, the analogy is the same. If one imagines one is in a prison, when one recognizes this and recognizes that escape is possible, one's not going to think, maybe later, maybe tomorrow. One will take that opportunity while one has it and flee from this prison, especially if we think of how prisons were in the past, places of abuse and torture and deprecation. If one has the opportunity to flee, one will flee. There won't be any hesitation. So this is the kind of attitude that marks the sufficient measure of the mind of definite emergence. So then to read the sentence. Therefore, you should generate that mind to the same extent as the mind that does not want to be stuck in a house ablaze with fire or stay locked up in prison, and to the same extent that it desires liberation from them. So keep these two analogies in mind, because it points out that a mere intellectual knowledge, and understand this, is insufficient. Some effort, insufficient. This needs to be generated with the same determined attitude, so that as if one was trapped in a blazing building, one would do all you could to free yourself. Or in one of these old style prisons, more of a tortured chamber, if one has an opportunity to flee, one will take it. There won't be hesitation. There won't be gathering of possessions. One will flee. This is the strength of mind required. And even then, the final line, it will then still be necessary to increase it. The meaning of the final line is what has been presented before in the previous sentence, or those two illustrations, refers to a mind that has been generated through meditation. That still, even with that determination, is still insufficient. It needs to be sustained. It needs to be uncontrived. Uncontrived. One should not require to generate this mind of a definite emergence based on conditions such as through meditation or seeing or observing, thinking of suffering. But it should be spontaneous, uncontrived, effortless, an urgent desire to escape from samsara. This is uncontrived definite emergence, and that is a path. When it has been cultivated to this level, that it is a spontaneous or effortless and urgent desire to escape from samsara, that is a path. So what's been presented there is really important. And I hope then it's clear what is meant by the measure of whether definite emergence has been generated or not. So now the next paragraph, which starts with a quotation from the Kadampa master Sharawa. So here a bit was missed out and the translation is not quite right. So the second line is changed a bit, but I'll read that second line twice. As Sharawa taught, if this attitude is no more than mediocre, like flour poured into inferior beer, forming a thin layer on the surface, the view that rejects the cause of cyclic existence, the origins, will also not become more than that. So I'll read this bit again. As Sharawa taught, if this attitude is no more than mediocre, like flour poured into inferior beer, forming a thin layer on the surface, the view that rejects the causes of cyclic existence, the origins, will also not become more than that. Accordingly, one striving for liberation, the cessation that is the ceasing of sufferings and origins, will be the same. Because of that, the desire to accomplish the path of liberation will be mere words, and also there will be no basis for the compassion that cannot bear the suffering of other beings who wander in cyclic existence. Since unsurpassed, uncontrived bodhicitta, which has the power to arouse the mind, will not arise, you become a Mahayanist only in the way your understanding follows from words. For that reason, you should cultivate this attitude again and again. So reading Sharawa's analogy, if this attitude is no more than mediocre, like flour poured into inferior beer. So beer is made from barley, and if it's inferior, this means it's very, maybe, how would you say, like very runny, very light, but in terms of its texture. So it's very runny. So to improve the quality of this inferior beer, which is made from barley, then barley flour or tsongkhapa will get poured into it, mixed with it, so that it becomes thicker and therefore of better quality. But if only a little bit of tsongkhapa is mixed with the beer, it's not going to change much. So it will be, reading it again, like flour poured into inferior beer, forming a thin layer on the surface. So the mistake here is that not only is the beer inferior, but the remedy is also insufficient. Too little tsongkhapa is being mixed with the beer. So it just forms a thin layer on the top. The tsongkhapa forms a thin layer on top of the beer, as opposed to mixing with it and making it thick, like if it was a soup, going from a light soup to a broth. It doesn't go to a thick broth, but just something that's very light. So that's the analogy, written in very archaic Tibetan, hence the translation is what it is. But now the meaning of it, if the attitude is no more than that, the view that rejects the causes of cyclic existence, the contaminated karma and afflictions, the origins, will also not become more than that. So the meaning then is that if one hasn't reflected well, then just like the analogy here with the beer, the impact of one's reflections on one's mind will be minor, will be insignificant, will be mediocre. The impact of one's reflections on one's mind will be superficial, on the surface of one's mind, not penetrating deep into your heart, and certainly not penetrating beyond the superficial surface, deep into your heart in a sustained manner. To a modern Western audience, it's a bit of an odd example, but certainly to the people at the time, and to be honest, to Tibetans today, this example is immediately understood. I guess if they can get past the archaic Tibetan, the example is immediately understood. So this was given in the context of nomads, for whom tsongkhapa was quite rare. They mainly had meat and products from milk to eat. So tsongkhapa was not so readily available. So therefore they would not have much to mix into beer or into milk. or into tea rather, into beer or into tea, to improve the quality of it. But still, in modern day, in modern times, for example, myself, then to improve my tea, to make it more substantial, I will mix Tsongkhapa in it. And this way it becomes thicker, it becomes more nourishing, more warming, more hearty to enjoy. So therefore, for a Tibetan audience, this example makes complete sense. But the meaning, though, is what, when explained, this should be clear. That if the origins of suffering have only been understood intellectually, the determination to abandon these sufferings will also be merely intellectual. It will not have an impact on one's way of thinking. And if it does have some impact, that impact will be superficial, will be sporadic. It will only occasionally arise. Whereas what needs to happen is it needs to enter deep within our mind and transform our way of thinking in a way that is not sporadic but sustained. The essence of what is being presented here really needs to be clear, because it is the summation of the purpose of what we've been looking at, the very point of what we've been looking at and been meditating on. Through meditating first on the sufferings of the lower realms, and then the sufferings of the higher realms, so in other words, on true sufferings, one comes to recognize there is no freedom anywhere. There is nothing within samsara that has any abiding value or essence. There is no rebirth or experience within a rebirth that is worthy of striving for, because it is still an expression of suffering. It is not. It's an expression of lasting happiness, because, in our true origins, because the causes for that experience within a rebirth or of a particular rebirth has come about in dependence on contaminated karma that is contaminated by the presence of the afflictions. Therefore, I have to gain freedom from cyclic existence in its entirety. I have to emerge from the suffering realms of samsara. I have to turn away from the afflictions, no longer be deceived by the afflictions, no longer be deceived by afflictions thinking this is okay to do, this is a virtuous path to follow, when it is not. And I need to emerge into a state liberated from samsara in its entirety. That is the mind of definite emergence, and generating that is the very purpose of the text thus far, these 178 pages. And moreover, when that mind is generated, I need to keep training in it repeatedly over a sustained period, so that it arises spontaneously, effortlessly, with this desire to escape, to gain freedom from these suffering realms. That is now effortless. It doesn't need to be intentionally cultivated. This then is the purpose of all this training. So that's it really brings us close to the end of our time. So we'll conclude with this the same last paragraph. Then we'll continue with it in a couple of weeks. But there's still 10 minutes, so if you have questions, then feel free to ask, and we're pointing there.
This urgent desire to leave samsara, that is the measure of the attainment of definite emergence.
The measure of attaining the path of accumulation, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah, entering into it. Yeah.
Yeah. Accumulation. The measure of the attainment of the path of accumulation. Yeah. Is that the same as what we're talking about?
Yeah. So is what's being presented here as the a measure of attaining the mind of definite emergence? Is this also the measure of attaining the path of accumulation? So in brief, yes. The answer in brief, yes. The expansive answer. There cannot be an attainment of the path of accumulation without the generation, the simultaneous generation of uncontrived definite emergence. To express it the other way around, with the generation or the attainment of uncontrived definite emergence, the path of accumulation is attained. Then, thank you very much. And just to mention at the end, The event at the stupa this evening has been cancelled, so too has Genda's talk, because the weather is going to get much worse than it is now, but luckily it's okay for one's journey home. So if you're planning on coming to Genda's talk tonight, that won't be happening now. Okay, thank you.